Hello. So, Death Knight. I have played around with the talents. Feel like I kind of know those inside and out. I was what level was I when I started? I'm gonna say around 50, 60, something like that. Got to no, I think I was 70. Yeah, I think I was 70. Um, and then I've been mostly doing the Hollow Fall dailies, which is why I am here in Hollow Falls, and wearing my Hollow Falls transmog, which I have. I have everything except for the back piece for some reason. I've gotten the cloaks for, I think, every other set except for mail and plate for some reason. So, that being said, I will start with the stats as I've been doing. And so, with Death Knight, you have runes and you have runic power. Now, runic power is a bit weird. I would say think of it kind of like rage, because the only thing that I know for sure that actually generates runic power is your frost fever, which is kind of was the focal point for each spec. I believe each one still has a disease. I know you have blood plague for blood, you have frost fever for frost, and then for unholy you have there we go, festering wound. It was something. There we go. And then they have their own plague that deals shadow damage. So, yeah, unholy, as I said, worked a bit differently. So, that being said, your runic rune regeneration is tied to your haste. So, I have been trying to prioritize haste. The main ability that you'll be using is Obliterate, which uses 2 runes. Aside from that, your mastery increases your damage of your frost abilities. So critical strike, mastery, versatility, any of those are going to be pretty good. But I would say haste would be the main thing you probably want to focus on. And that's honestly pretty much it. I would say haste and mastery, because you'll get critical strike and versatility kind of on randomly as a secondary stat. So, and you're more inclined to find pieces that have haste and mastery, so they do kind of tend to work together. Mastery hasn't made too much of a difference, but it does work just generally overall. So it will benefit everything you have, so it's not a terrible thing. And then as far as the talents go, so the reason that I say this is fairly close, it's the closest DPS spec I've seen to a tanking spec, minus the mitigation, as I said. And that is because of Death Strike, which you don't have to take. I think at one point, I think this was just a baseline ability, but now in these new talent trees, you can choose to take it. So between that and then improved Death Strike, which reduces the cost and increase healing. And yeah, blood draw. When you fall below 30% health, you drain health from nearby enemies. And damage you take is reduced by 10%, and your death strike cost is reduced by 10% for 8 seconds. Can only occur every 2 minutes. You also have a passive that, there we go, that will allow Death Strike to be free and heals for an additional 10% when you kill an enemy that yields experience or honor. And this will proc back to back. So you can use multiple Death Strikes and heal yourself back up. And that, with those 3 abilities, that is pretty good. You do have to watch, because there's this weird way that Death Strike works. It deals damage, heals you for 40% of all damage taken in the last 5 seconds, and that is important. Minimum 11% of maximum health. So, if you are just entering combat, it may not do as much. And then from there, I mostly played around with some of the AoE abilities. So, of the talents on the Frost side, they all basically just kind of enhance what you already have. So you start out with Frost Strike, which is kind of the signature ability for Frost Death Knight. I do have to say it was a bit weak until I really got my gear a bit more situated and things like that. It just barely did anything. I really used Death Strike a lot in the beginning. And then just kind of used Frost Strike as a finisher and kind of a filler ability when it didn't make sense to use Death Strike. Obliterate replaces Rune Strike and Howling Blast, which is a range, basically a spell ability that applies your Frost Fever. It will apply Frost Fever to multiple enemies at once, so you will get a lot of AoE damage off that. Depending on what you take, that and Death and Decay is basically all you'll start with. As far as damage is concerned, and then I think you end up with Remorseless Winter as well. Just making sure. I don't think I had to take that. I think I already had it. Yeah, so then from there you get into kind of quality of life passives for Obliterate, and then Remorseless Winter. Increase Frost Strike damage by 20%. Damaging an enemy with a runic power ability increases strength. Increases Obliterate. Obliterate has an increased chance to trigger Rhyme, and Howling Blast generates 6 runic power. So Rhyme is important. It is, there we go, Obliterate has a 60% chance, and Frost Scythe has a 30% chance to cause your next Howling Blast to consume no runes and deal 350 additional damage. And that will proc quite a bit.
Strike. Show them what it means to cross the flame's radiance.
And then, yeah, so increase your maximum runic power by 20%. Increases Howling Blast damage. Remorseless Winter damage. Remorseless Winter does not, from what I can tell, freeze the target. I didn't look at the PvP abilities, but I don't think so. That was the big thing. Hurry. Was if you could stay close to a target long enough and they got enough stacks of Remorseless Winter, it would freeze them in place, and it doesn't look like anything does that anymore. Oh, there we go. Death's Chill. So your Remorseless Winter and Chains of Ice apply Death's rooting them in place for right. All targets within 8 yards. So there you go. So it's a PvP ability now. So if we're expecting it to do that, as I was, it doesn't stack, doesn't do any of that. Just does constant damage on a 20-second cooldown, which is perfectly fine. It's always available when I've needed it. Let's see here. When Pillar of Frost expires, your strength is increased. Last 2 seconds longer for each Obliterate, Frost Strike, during Pillar of Frost. Pillar of Frost summons a Frost Whelp who breathes on all enemies within 40 yards. Each unique enemy hit.
The mighty adversary has taken the field.
Mastery.
Get in
I've
there,
never
soldier.
seen this, and I've had this for most, if not all, the time that I've been leveling. Reduces Pillar of Frost cooldown by 15 seconds. So, as you're seeing here, pretty quality of life, as I said. Everything really works together in one direction. Stacking 5 times, Obliterate and Fast Strike consumes a stack to deal additional damage. Each rune spent during Remorseless Winter increases the damage by 10%, extends the duration by 0.5 seconds. Your auto attack damage increased by 10%. This amount is increased by Ice Talons, which is another passive
we need your help. Is that the best warrior they can offer? Get in there and show them the strength of the flame!
Oh, there we go. There we go. Your runic power spending abilities increase your melee attack speed by 6% for 10 seconds, stacking up 5 times. So kind of what I was saying, haste is kind of a big thing.
Bring them
with,
the warmth of the
Frost.
sacred flame.
The quicker you can do something, obviously, the more damage.
There are too many injured on the field. Bring them the warmth of the sacred flame.
Yeah, your auto attack criticals have a chance to send a torrent of ice, dealing frost damage to enemies in front of you. Empowered by Rhyme, Healing Blast deals 6% increased damage to your primary target. Your runic power spending abilities have a chance to additionally deal 44% of the damage dealt over 4 seconds. So, as I said, you get kind of your main 3, so Frost Strike, Obliterate, and Howling Blast, and then everything else for the most part works around that. Everything I didn't take, largely, with the exception of maybe a couple abilities, has to do with how you do AoE damage. So, went ahead and took Horn of Winter, which is kind of useful. I kind of forget I have it half the time. This has worked in different ways over the time that it has been in the game. I want to say it was originally, when I remember first playing Death Knight, it worked as a kind of like a what is it, Blade Dance that
Those crawlers
rogues have. Like, it was an ability you could toggle on and off. It kind of was a personal buff, is what I remember. It stayed on until you canceled it, kind of a thing. I don't specifically remember what it did. But in addition to that, you could also take Empowered Rune Weapon, which I don't need. I never used this anytime I've ever played Death Knight in any spec. So it empowers your weapon, gaining haste and generating 1 rune, and 5 runic power instantly, and every 5 seconds for 20 seconds, which you think would be really good. As I said, haste is good. It just, to me, it's always been very clunky to try to work into a rotation. Horn of Winter, 45-second cooldown. Gaining 2 runes and generating 25 runic power. Like, you get it, you use it, it's done and over with. Like, if you just need that little bit of extra. Typically, when I'll use this is if a rune isn't quite off cooldown yet, so I can't use Obliterate. By the time I use Obliterate, I'm usually going to use Death Strike. More often than not, maybe Frost Strike, but usually like Death Strike. Usually I have a proc of Howling Blast, so it's just kind of running through that rotation. Everything else pretty much has something to do with an AoE ability, except for this one row. Don't forget that Death Knights can Runeforge, basically put an enchant on their weapon. So I had taken a bunch of things that worked with Razor Ice, which does extra weapon damage as frost damage, increasing enemies' vulnerability to your frost attacks by 3%, stacking up to 5 times. I played around with it. It wasn't all that great. I had all 3 of these, and I've looked at a few different Frost Death Knights as I've been leveling, and they didn't look it either. So, I kind of moved some things around. Starting out, I had Chill Streak, which deals frost damage to targets and reduces movement speed. Chill Streak bounces up to 9 times between closest targets within 6 yards. Also took, what did I take? Bounce range is increased, and each time Chill Streak bounces, it has a 25% chance to increase the maximum number of bounces by 1. And they suffer 12% increased damage from Chill Streak each time they are struck by it. I think I took this one that increases the range. Tried it, just didn't really, just was kind of lackluster. That was basically how I'd sum up a lot of these AoEs, just didn't really seem all that impactful. Was kind of hopeful for Breath of Sindragosa. Problem with this is that it consumes runic power. And that is, like I said, think of it like Rage, so it's a bit difficult to generate, and you're using it on Death Strike and Frost Strike, but mostly Death Strike, so that's keeping you alive. So it just didn't work all that well. Didn't have this for too long. And then there is Glacier Advance, which specifically mentions, well, it applies Razor Ice, but also basically just works directly in front of you, which is not all that helpful. So I ended up settling with Frost Scythe, which I remember was introduced in Warlords, because I remember being in my garrison and trying this out on the training dummy you have in your garrison. And at that time, I didn't care for it. It actually works better than what it looks at first glance. You strike all the enemies in front of you, which is okay. This attack always critical strikes, and critical strikes with Frost Ice deal 4 times normal damage, so this actually does do more damage than anything else, I think, that I figured out, or
We've
fairly
got them on the run.
Close to
me! Let us give them a reason to keep running!
Deals reduced damage beyond 5 targets. Continue Killing Machine, reduces cooldown.
Rally to me, and we will finish this fight!
Here somewhere. It is a, there we go. Oh, there we go. Went right over it.
We are the
Should have
flames'
known it was a
radiance,
frost ability.
defenders of
Your auto
Merodar,
attack
and
criticals
today
have a
we
chance
fall.
to make your next Obliterate deal frost damage and critically strike. So, there you go. Yeah, so that seemed to work fairly well. So what I will do is I will use a charge of Death and Decay, and then Frost Scythe, and then just keep Frost Fever up, and then just run through my single target rotation, and then I pretty well in combat keep Remorseless Winter on cooldown. So I mean, you have enough things that can do AoE damage. Some of them have a cooldown, so that's fine. You can spam Howling Blast. That shouldn't be a problem. Never really has been with Frost. And yeah, so that's pretty much it. So everything either works with Razor Ice, which is an enchant you have to constantly keep putting on your weapon if you change weapons, or you can take one of the other AoE, or one of the utilities. So, as I said, I kind of know these talents inside and out at this point, so this seemed to work perfectly fine. I did take Frostworm's Fury, which I mainly use. I took it because a lot of Death Knights in PvP I've seen use this, and it freezes. It does a ton of frost damage, but more importantly, it freezes the target. So it doesn't specifically say that, but it does actually freeze the target. There we go. You actually have to take a talent for that. So Frostwood Fury has a 50% reduced cooldown and freezes all enemies it hits by 3 seconds. So that is typically when I'll use it. So while they're frozen, what I will do is throw down Death and Decay, Frost Scythe, and then run through my single target, and that usually gives me a chance to heal and everything. And then there is a talent that you can take that summons, if you took Riders of the Apocalypse, it will summon all 4 horsemen. When there we go. Army of the Dead and Frostworm's Fury call upon all 4 horsemen to aid you for 20 seconds. I do and I don't like this because I don't always need, it's kind of overkill sometimes. I don't always need all 4. But nothing's on a super long cooldown. It's just a minute and a half, so it's not terrible. And you will get another horseman when you re-enter combat. Like, I don't have any trouble spawning
victory
one of the 4.
For the flames' radiance. Take a moment
and then the other thing I wanted to mention, and I actually looked this up. So one of the things with Frost is it used to be a dual wield spec. So Blood and Unholy used a 2-handed weapon, and Frost dual wield, and you still can. However, I just started out using a 2-handed weapon because that's just what I had equipped. And thanks to Might of the Frozen Waste, so wielding a 2-handed weapon increases Obliterate damage by 30%, and your auto attack critical strikes always grant killing machines. So it really is more impactful to use a 2-handed weapon. I actually looked it up, and this was added in, if I can remember this now, it was added in, was it Pandera? And it was kind of like the monk ability, where it did one thing if you had a 2-handed weapon, it did something else if you dual wield, which is what brewmasters used to have a passive very similar back in the day. And then it was taken out in Legion. I want to say it was removed, brought back in Shadowlands, and then this is where we are now. I think that was correct. And it's had mostly the same effect, they've just changed the percentage. So obliterate damage by that has changed. It usually went up. It's had a few other utilities, minor effects here and there, but generally speaking, that is mostly what it did, was increased your weapon damage. And then just to look at the Death Knight talents. So you're basically just taking kind of what you've always had. As I said, Death Strike is optional, so if you decide you want to go in a different direction, you can. Most of these are passives. Most of these will be passives that you're familiar with having before. The one difference is your Raise Dead, which I had to take in order to take Cleaving Strikes, which allows Obliterate to cleave, basically, because it hits up to 2 additional enemies, so that would be more of a cleave effect. While remaining in your Death and Decay, which is very similar to how Blood works. So, wasn't really hyped up on the Raise Dead, don't really use it that often. That being said, it's not a terrible thing to have, just don't really use it that often. But this used to be something that was more limited to Unholy. So, you definitely don't have a shortage of damage. I've tried using it in combination with Frostworm's Fury. I typically just kind of use it when either I'm dealing with more of a single target, or like something's on cooldown, like if Frostworm's Fury is on cooldown, I think I've used it in place of that. So I mean, it's just kind of an emergency ability at this point, I guess, if you were to summarize what I use it for. But I definitely wanted Cleaving Strikes, so I would say that is worthwhile. It also seems to work with Frost Strike, that, or it's just a visual glitch, but it seems like it's doing AoE damage as well. And then from there, so you get Icebound Fortitude. Went ahead and took Mind Freeze. Didn't take Cold Thirst, which, if you use Mind Freeze, will grant 10 runic power. I just haven't been on a lot of classes, and it's been fine. But if you really wanted to try to maximize your runic power, doing the dailies for Hollowfall, there are enemies that you can interrupt, so that would definitely be one way to help. I did take Wrathwalk, even though I ended up with Death Charge, which kind of works like the Paladin ability that lets them call their charger. So I have 2 movement abilities, which is kind of nice. Death Charger is quicker, increases speed by 100%, whereas Wrathwalk is just 70%. But it's good to have 3 abilities you can use, because Death Charger will have 2 charges. So gain 5% haste while you remain within Death and Decay. Death Advance grants an additional movement speed over the first 3 seconds, so that would be what Death Charge replaces. Reduces cooldown of Anti-Magic Shell, which I don't actually use, but I need for Permafrost. Okay. By 20 seconds, and increases the duration amount absorbed. Your auto attack damage grants you an absorption shield equal to 30% of the damage dealt. That is helpful. Kind of puts you in that wannabe Blood Death Knight category, because you're getting the healing and you have somewhat of a shield. So, Chains of Ice affects 1 additional nearby enemy. We already looked at that. Absorbs are 50% more effective on you. I took Asphyxiate. I haven't really used it, but it is a pretty good single target CC. So, damage taken from area of effects reduced by 3% when suffering a loss of control effect. This ability is increased by an additional 6% for 6 seconds. Your auto attacks reduce the target's auto attack speed by 5% for 30 seconds, stacking up 4 times. Consuming a rune has a chance to increase your strength by 6% for 6 seconds. Magic damage taken is reduced by 5%, and duration of harmful magic effects against you is reduced by 35%. So I took this because I was kind of thinking PvP. So if I didn't do PvP, you could probably take that and put it into something else. Your diseases have a chance to weaken your enemy, causing your attacks against them to deal 6% increased damage for 5 seconds. Increases the effectiveness of your Runeforge effects. Unfortunately, it's one of those things where you do have to take this. I'm terrible about remembering to use the Runeforge effects. If you, you know, as with most enchants, it will put a visual effect on your weapon, which you can hide. So I don't know if it was always like that or if that was something newer. The ability to hide, I think, is newer. We've only had that for a couple, 2-3 expansions now. So, but I wanted Grip of Death. Death in Decay reduces the movement speed of enemies within its area by 90%, decaying by 10% every second. While Lichborn increases Lichborn's duration by 2 seconds, and while active, damage taken is reduced. So that is, again, kind of like the Paladin ability that turns them into a Guardian. Draw upon unholy energy to become undead for 12 seconds. It doesn't actually change your appearance. Increasing Leech by 6%, reducing damage taken by 15%, and making you immune to Charm, Spears, and Sleep. So I actually reversed. I had Icebound Fortitude, which back in the day was like the go-to. This was almost as good as like your Paladin bubble, as I remember. I actually switched it because I wanted the Leech effect. This just works better. Typically, when I use Pillar of Frost, it's when which increases your strength, so basically just increases all your abilities. Typically, when there are multiple targets, or when dealing with like an elite or a rare or something like that. But typically it's been when I've been pulling like multiple mobs, because I've been trying to pull a lot of these dailies, like you got to go fill a bar. So I've been trying to pull like multiple mobs at the same time. So the only time I've died is when I've ran into an elite. When I pull too many elites, I just can't keep up. I don't have the mitigation. I've tried it every which way, and it just doesn't work. So I tend to avoid those, or try to be mindful of how many I pull. Leech increases Leech by 3%. So even a little bit of Leech is pretty good, especially if you have a way to heal. It just increases healing and returns a portion of damage and healing to you. So it's 3%, so it's kind of zeroed out. But even a little bit does tend to help, and it will stack with Lichborn. So it actually ends up being 18%. If I recall, or 9%. That doesn't make any sense. Oh, I was looking at the wrong thing. Leech by 6%. There we go. Helps if you actually read the right thing. Your chance to be critically struck is reduced by 3%, and your armor is increased by 6%. What is my armor? So 31. So that on par with what a typical physical damage is. You're typically not going to be at much higher than that. If you get to 50%, you're some sort of a tank, or you have some really good class slash spec specific more likely ability. Damage taken below 30% health is reduced by 35%. And then this one, I kind of had no choice. Death Advance, Death and Decay, and Death Grips have one additional charge. I mainly wanted Death's Grip. Death Advance is fine. Death and Decay I never use 2 charges of, so. And yeah, so there you go. So not too bad, as I said. It's a somewhat, on the surface, a somewhat bland DPS spec, but if you set it up, depending on how you set it up, you can do some really fun things. I would say without Death Strike, you're probably not going to be able to stay alive for very long unless you have potions or some other way of healing. You do need some way of self-healing. At max level, if you were decently geared, you might be able to get away with it without using Death Strike or any sort of self-healing. Maybe just a potion or some food in between combats. But otherwise, I would definitely say this is something that you probably are going to want to take. And it never really, outside of Blood, was all that good, honestly, that I remember. I've tried to, like, do this before, like, set everything up. Understanding it was DPS, but setting it up to kind of run through the same rotation that I would with Blood, just with the, you know, frost-specific, frost-appropriate abilities. And Death Strike was always where it kind of fell apart, because you don't have the mastery, you're not getting the healing, the shield, or anything, and it seems like they kind of addressed that, so I was very happy with these two abilities with Death Strike and improved Death Strike. So, and the Will of the Necropolis and Blood Draw, like, you have things that really work together, kind of in a single focus. So you really only have to figure out if you want to be more kind of AoE heavy. I've seen, like I said, I've seen a few different Frost Death Knights as I was leveling, and they kind of took different things for the AoE, so there doesn't seem to be like one specific thing that people are leaning towards. I was disappointed that Breath of Cindergrosa wasn't better. I'm hoping, I haven't really done much at level 80. Don't know exactly what I am going to do with this character at level 80. That's why I wanted to do this now, while things were fresh in my mind. In dungeons, when I did do some dungeons to farm the this Hive Breaker's Dipper. So I did do that one dungeon a few times. My haste was at 20%, and that seemed to be fine. I didn't have any trouble with runic regeneration or runic power or anything like that. That being said, it's always different, of course, between being in a group and being out in the world doing PvE. You did also, I was going to mention, because I just saw it on the bar there, you do have Death Pack as well, which heals you for 50% of your maximum health, but absorbs incoming healing equal to 30% of your maximum health. So I never cared for things like this. but it is an option for healing. Yeah, not too many changes really. If you've played Deathland before, I know I say that a lot, but at this point, yeah, just kind of glancing over. I don't think there's anything really to mention that I didn't, about the abilities that I didn't take in the Death Knight side. As I said, I've been doing the dailies for the Hollow Fall. And the rotation I've been using for that because it's a lot of pulling mobs and filling bars for all the quests that you do. You just go between Hollow Fall and the Nerubian zone. So I'll start with Remorseless Winter, and then Obliterate, Howling Blast to apply Frost Fever to the targets, and then typically Death Strike. If I do a big pull, essentially, I will use Frostworm to freeze, and then that, Death and Decay down, use my Frost Synth, and then through my single target rotation, and then keep Remorseless Winter up. And that's pretty much it. And then if I don't need healing, I'll use Frost Strike. And that is pretty much it.